President Trump wrapping up his news conference at the G7 summit where he talked about a wide range of issues. But the big headline that kept dominating reporter questions over and over, of course, is Iran and the deal between the United States and Iran. So let's break that down and go live to CBS News senior White House correspondent Weijia Jiang watching all of this in Washington. What are your takeaways, Weijia, as we await that Friday signing?
Well, Reed, despite the president speaking for quite some time here and taking several questions, a lot remains unanswered, which makes sense because this is a memorandum of understanding, which the president himself acknowledged during one of the last questions he received, which is, hey, you know, if this is such a big deal, why aren't you sticking around to sign it? Because remember, instead, Vice President J.D. Vance is going to be the one traveling to attend the signing ceremony. And the president said, because it's an MOU. And he implied that perhaps it would not come to a final deal because there is a timeline on when they can hash out the fine print, which is 60 days. And so there's a lot of optimism here. The president expressed that during this entire press conference. But the fact is, Reed, that there is still a lot to work out in terms of the timing, in terms of the logistics, in terms of the security for the Strait of Hormuz, and what Iran is truly going to agree to ultimately for its nuclear ambitions. The president continues to claim that they have agreed to give up all their ambitions for procurement, for development. He was unable to really specify whether that meant for civilian use as well. And you know, another really telling point, Reed, was when it comes to this highly enriched uranium that has been a constant sticking point.
Right.
And the president said it doesn't really matter when that is retrieved because it's not like they can just go and access it at any point. And so there are still a lot of these details, Reed, that have to be worked out. But what I will say is that the president continues to try to claim this as a victory, even though he himself has acknowledged, rightfully so, that this is really just the jumping off point to start negotiations for filling in all those details that are really going to make a difference, Reed.
Well, it certainly is not seen as a huge victory. We have a president who himself says, I like to win, I'm a winner. So can we maybe assume that that's the reason why he's not going to be there for that signing of the memorandum, that this is not the slam dunk win that the president would set his entire value system around?
I believe that the president is being cautiously optimistic. And it's not that he doesn't believe this is a victory because, look, it is a huge development that Iran is coming to the table, that they claim that they, in good faith, are going to try to hash out these details. So I do believe that the president views this as a win, but he wants to sign the big deal with a capital
Right.
B, when it's not just a memo, but it's actually a peace agreement. And so, you know, he said that perhaps this MOU isn't the sort of document that he should be signing. He also made light of another, question that is actually pretty legitimate because he is sending his vice president to go and sign this MOU. Vance has also been the face in recent days and really for months now of a lot of public messaging when it comes to the war. And you heard our colleague there ask if the reason behind that is because in case it fails, is Vance going to have to take all of the accountability for that? And if it wins, then President Trump can take the credit for it. And he laughed it off and said, that sounds like a great idea. But it does beg the question why, to your original point here, Reed, he is not more involved with something that he continues to claim is such a victory.
All right, Weijia Jiang watching that one for us live. Thank you so much. Good to talk to you, Weijia. Let's turn now live to CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes, who is in France. Nancy, you were in the room. We heard that question. I was really fascinated by the thesis, the premise of that question about that memorandum of understanding and whether it actually has teeth. Talk to us about your question for those viewers who might just be tuning in right now and the answer that you got.
Sure. Well, the president, Reed, has been making some pretty grandiose claims all week here in Evian about the things that this 1.5 page agreement will accomplish. Most notably, he says it will prevent Iran from ever getting a nuclear weapon. but he hasn't explained how exactly the deal will do that. And the drafts that have been circulating, only mention Iran's nuclear program a couple of times. The rest of the document deals with the Strait of Hormuz, deals with sanctions, unfreezing assets, and things like that. And so I just wanted to ask him directly, why are you claiming that this particular deal is going to prevent Iran from ever getting a nuclear weapon? And he said, well, if they try to get a nuclear weapon, then we'll just bomb them, which may be the case, but that's not the same as a deal that enforces it. So I followed up by asking him if there's anything enforceable in this deal, any kind of mechanism that prevents Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And he kind of blew it off. He said, well, what do you want me to do, sue them or take them to court? What kind of enforcement are you talking about? But the reality is that the two sides are about to embark on a lengthy negotiation that will involve enforceable benchmarks that would be enforced by the U.S., enforced by international agencies to hopefully ensure that Iran doesn't begin nuclear development again. And whether that negotiation will be successful is still up in the air. But it's pretty clear that this memorandum of understanding does not do what President Trump claims it does, preventing Iran from ever getting a nuclear weapon.
13 U.S. service members lost in this conflict, and so I think that's why your question relative to how this happens and the machinations of how this actually gets implemented to keep a nuclear weapon is especially germane. I also thought it was interesting, Nancy, when the president talked about conversations with the Chinese president and also with Vladimir Putin of Russia, actually giving them credit, speaking to holding off and showing some restraint there. What was the take in the room when he talked about those two men who lead countries that are communist countries and are arguably seen as not especially friendly to the United States of America?
You know, this is a case that he has been making. He made it in the run-up to his visit to China because certainly China could have flexed its muscle more in this situation. It is the largest purchaser of Iranian oil, and therefore its trade with Iran was very significantly affected by this months-long blockade in the Strait of Hormuz. But China kind of held its powder and watched and waited to see how things played out, and I think that gave Trump a little more wiggle room, which he's clearly grateful for because he brought it up again today. Interesting that you bring up Russia, because while he did say that he was glad that Russia didn't get involved too much in this conflict, he also said that really Russia is suffering more greatly from its conflict with Ukraine than the Ukrainians are. And that's something he's said a couple of times this week. He has said that he really believes that it's in Russia's interest to cut a deal. It's a subtle shift in tone from the past when he has either called on both leaders equally to cut a deal or even said that Ukraine doesn't have the cards. But at this point, and I'll stress at this point because it could always change, at this point he seems to be putting his thumb on the scale to some degree on the Ukrainian side and saying Russia is really suffering here and it needs to get out.
All right, so we're looking at Ukraine, we're looking at Russia, mention of China, but then also another player that factors very big into this Iran deal, and that's Israel. What's your read of the room, not only from the president and those who are standing behind him, but also from the other leaders of those G7 nations relative to Israel, speaking specifically about Hezbollah and Lebanon?
Yeah, I mean, the president unloaded on the Israeli prime minister for the second straight day today. And what's notable about that is, we see President Trump criticize other leaders all the time, Reed, but this time he was doing it on the world stage at the G7 summit with the entire world watching. And it's so striking because Israel was America's primary war partner the past 3 months. And yet now the president is saying that he feels that the Israelis have gone too far, that he thinks that they've been too vicious, and it's clearly driving a wedge between the U.S. and the Israelis. I will tell you that some of the G7 leaders have made more subtle criticisms of Israel. Generally, they couch it as concern for the Lebanese and their fears that a humanitarian crisis could be brewing because of all the people who have been displaced in Lebanon. But they have been wary of going too far because they know what close allies President Trump and Bibi Netanyahu are. And they've been very cognizant of the fact that, they're working quite well with President Trump right now. That hasn't always been the case, and they don't want to do anything to rock the boat.
Nancy Cordes following the president in France. Always an honor to talk to you. Thank you, Nancy. Come back home safe to us, will you? Live now to CBS News White House reporter Olivia Rinaldi, who's in Versailles as the president wraps up that G7 summit. Olivia, what can we expect for the rest of the president's visit to France?
Well, Reed, it's good to be with you. This is the final stop from President Trump's trip to the G7. He'll be coming here to Versailles for dinner tonight with the French President Emmanuel Macron. There will also be other foreign ministers from France who will be here at this dinner tonight. This was one of those things that was interesting on the schedule because it was billed as a private dinner between President Trump and President Macron. We know that this has been expanded a little bit. We actually also just talked to the chief cheese chef who is here, who was wearing a jacket that said Liberté, Égalité, Camembert. And so they're very clearly excited about this dinner tonight. But it also kind of follows a bit of a trend because last year at the G7, which was held in Canada, President Trump actually left early. He came back to Washington, and that was before there was those strikes inside of Iran, those B-2 bombers that the president often talks about. So they have gotten creative over here in Europe in a way to keep President Trump engaged in coming to these summits. At the NATO summit last year, they had him have dinner with some of the royals there in the Dutch to keep him occupied and keep him engaged through the end of that NATO summit. Seems that French President Macron took a page out of that book, inviting him for dinner tonight. President Trump said he is a fan of nice places, so he's very excited for this dinner tonight. After it wraps, he will head back to the U.S. for what will be surely a very, very late night landing at Joint Base Andrews.
All right, Olivia Rinaldi with arguably one of the more beautiful assignments of the day. Thank you so much. Good to talk to you, friend.